afternoon. My name is Sharon Kennedy. Welcome to History Nebraska Brown Bag History Learning Series. Talks are held monthly on the third Thursday in Old Father Family Auditorium at the Nebraska History Museum in downtown Lincoln. Learn more about History Nebraska and our programs and services at history.nebraska.gov. If you're not a member of History Nebraska, I encourage you to join. Your support allows us to provide programs like the Brown Bag Learning Series free for all Nebraskans. For a full list of membership benefits, visit our website. Special thanks to the Nebraska State Historical Society Foundation for their financial support, and today I also want to thank AARP Nebraska for their support, which allows us to tape and broadcast these programs across the state. We'd also like to thank LNK-TV, a service of the City of Lincoln, which produces these programs. If you'd like to watch previous Brown Bag lectures, visit the Nebraska History the History Nebraska YouTube page at www.youtube.com/Nebraska/Nebraska and see the playlists. So our topic today is World War II Dog Defense Program, and our speaker is Trevor Jones. He's asked that you hold your questions until the end of the program. Trevor Jones has served as the Executive Director and CEO of History Nebraska since July 2016. Upon learning about the World War II Dog Defense Program at Fort Robinson, Jones recognized a story that Nebraskans would be proud to know. He sought to bring to light, through a children's book, the relatively obscure yet fascinating story of one of the largest and most effective canine training outposts in the nation. Please help me welcome Trevor Jones.
Hello, welcome. I'm so glad that you are all here today. We're going to talk about dogs in World War II. And you might not know anything about this, but during World War II, thousands of Americans donated their dogs to the U.S. military. And these dogs were trained as scouts and as mine-detecting dogs and as medical dogs, and they served in every theater of the war. And most of these dogs for defense were trained at Fort Robinson, Nebraska. And this experience during World War II informed how service dogs are trained to this very day. So this is book, Major a Soldier Dog, tells the story about the War Dog Program through the dog's eyes, and it follows the dog's donation by a child, his training at Fort Robinson, his war service, and finally how he was discharged and he was reunited with his owner at the war's end. So if you were worrying that there was a happy ending to this children's story, there is a happy ending to this story. We'll talk about some not so happy endings today, but this one has a happy ending. So just to reassure you. So we're going to cover really three things today I'm going to talk about. The first of them is a true story is told through a children's book about World War II from the perspective of a dog. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about how dogs see the world, because they see the world very different from us, and we were trying to show that in the children's book. The second, we're going to talk about the Dogs for Defense program and the dog training program in particular at Fort Robinson, Nebraska. So we'll talk about the entire program as a whole, and we'll talk about what happened at Fort Robinson. And the last thing that we're going to do is I'm going to give you a little bit of a behind-the-scenes look about creating a historically accurate children's book, how we work to make the images reflect what actually happened. So even if kids didn't even know that we would make sure that it was historically accurate. But you might be asking yourself, that's great, these three things, but why should I care? Why is a dog training program in World War II relevant to my life today? And part of the reason that we really wanted to do this as a children's book is that it helps us think about the concept of patriotism and the concept of sacrifice. And I think these are pretty abstract concepts, even for adults to grasp. What does it mean to be patriotic? What does it mean to sacrifice for something larger than yourselves? But the Dogs for Defense program, if we consider that, so if we rephrase this question and we say, would you give up your pet to help your country? That's a different way of looking at this issue. So abstract concepts of patriotism and sacrifice get easier to grasp at that time, both for kids and adults. And I think it's really easy to say that I believe in something, but it's not until you actually have to sacrifice something for that belief that belief really matters, right? And so as I'm talking today, and we'll come back to this at the end, I want you to think about a beloved pet that you have or have had sometime in your life, and think that if your community or your country came to you and said, we need that pet, and you can help us, would you give that up with no guarantee that pet would come back to you? Would you make that sacrifice? So that's what I want you to think about as we're talking about this book today. So I'm going to read you the children's book first, and that's going to really help you understand everything we're going to talk about from them. Then I'm going to break it down and go through the three things I talked about. So reminder, the book is told from the perspective of the dog. His name, of course, is Major. He's the hero of our story. So I'm going to give you that part of it first. When I was little, my best friend was Sid. He smelled like soap, dirt, and syrup, and we played all day in the snow. I loved to sleep close to him at night, where I heard the branches on the roof and the snores of his parents. One day, things changed. I could smell that Sid and my family were excited and a little scared, so I licked them. I did not know how to feel, so I barked a lot. Soon after that, we got in the car. I licked tears from Sid's face while we drove. We arrived at a new place with loud thumping noises that hurt my ears. 2 men grabbed me and tried to push me into a dirty box. I was scared, so I bit them. Sid crawled into the box and called me, but he was crying and would not look at me. I got into the box to comfort him, but a hand pulled him out and the door slammed shut with a bang. I was trapped. I traveled for a long time and arrived at a place with many people and even more smells. I was poked and marked, and I did not enjoy that. There were many other dogs of all sizes, and more were arriving all the time. I missed Sid, but at least I was not alone. I made friends with other dogs, like Taffy and Poochie and Kimmel, and they all had come from far away. We did not get to see each other every day, but we tried to let each other know we were fine. It was always loud with so many dogs talking at once, so sometimes it was hard to sleep. Soon I met a man named Zeke. He smelled like bacon and wool, and he needed my help, climbing, running, and finding things. I was not always sure what he wanted me to do, but I wanted to make Zeke happy, so I did my best. Taffy just wanted to chase sticks, cats, and people. She kept running away, but they always caught her. There were so many dogs, and we all learned different things. And you could see all the different types of dogs. After a while, they threw a party for us. I got some special treats, and Zeke got a piece of paper that I tried to eat. They shipped us off again in a train that smelled like oil and onions. I was with friends, and there were new people who wanted to pet me, but that was not allowed. Only Zeke could touch me. The trip was scary. The water was much bigger than any water I had seen at home. It smelled like fish, but I could not find any. The way the boat moved made my stomach feel weird. Days of playing seemed far away, and the smells of Sid, my family, and my home faded. There were booming sounds and smells of burning tires, but I wanted to help Zeke, and he needed me. We were always tired and dirty, and Zeke smelled scared much of the time. Every day we went for long walks where I paid attention to strange sounds and smells. On one of our walks, I got nervous. I could smell unfamiliar people and hear feet stepping on branches. I knew that Zeke and the others were in danger. I told Zeke about them by tugging as hard as I could at my leash. Zeke stopped right away, and he and everyone else crept backwards for a long time. They kept quiet until I told them I could not smell or hear anything anymore. Zeke scratched my ears, and I got extra treats that night at camp. We had many more days and nights like this one. Finally, after what seemed like a long time, The men in the camp gathered one morning. Their leader said words in a happy voice, and everyone started cheering. I did not know what happened, but I knew it was good news. I started barking, and they did not even tell me to be quiet. Soon we got back on a large boat and went back across the water, but this time everyone smelled happy and laughed a lot. I got all the treats I wanted. Once we got off the boat, I got on a train that smelled like chocolate, but Zeke would not give me any. When it stopped, we had returned to where I met Zeke for the first time. The smells of my friends had faded so much I could barely make them out. Even worse, Zeke left, and I worried about being lonely. A new person, Carol, started taking care of me and other dogs. She had a gentle voice and smiling eyes. She asked me to do different things. Instead of barking at people I did not know, I had to sit still. She let everyone pet me instead of only Zeke. I liked that part. It was not hard to learn, but it was different from being with Zeke. When the other dogs and I did something that Carol liked, she gave us treats. One day, Carol gave me a hug and a smile and put me into a crate smelling like fresh pine. I was sad to leave, but there was nothing to do but sleep and smell the world going by. When the train stopped, the crate opened, and someone was there. He was bigger, so I was not sure at first, but as soon as I smelled and licked him, I knew it was my old friend Sid. Now I play with the other dogs, and I am gentle with the small ones. Sometimes the old smells come back to me, and I remember my trip across the water and back. I even got my picture in the paper, and people thank me for what I did. I am happy that I helped Zeke and his friends, but I am even happier to curl up with Sid, safe and sound. So that's the story. And I'm going to break that apart for you in just a minute. But I'm going to talk about sort of the dog, Major and his world, how a dog sees the world. And I wanted to get the story the most realistic as possible from the dog's perspective. So I spent a fairly ridiculous amount of time learning about how dogs see our world, a human world. And there's actually several dog research laboratories that study this. So you can actually, there's scientific studies about dog perception. So that's what I used to base this on. This is an early draft up here. One of the things to know about dogs is that smell is their most important sense. They see the world the way that we use our eyes through smells. And layers of smells are the way that dogs tell time. By different smells, by how strong a smell is. That's how they tell how much time has gone by. So if you have a dog, that's why your dog is always trying to pee on the same spot every single time, is because it's letting the other dogs know how frequently, how often it's been there. And the other dogs can smell the layers of the smells to see if that dog is a one-time visitor, a multiple-time visitor, has been visiting for a long time, short time. So smell is their perception of the world. We thought about how do we represent this in a book? And so we wanted to show how this looked like for sight for us. So we wanted to make Major following a scent trail so that you could see the smell. And so when you think about perception of a dog, the smells are bright for a dog. It would be like a bright light, a strong smell. When the dog was smelling something good or important, we wanted those in the illustrations to be more vibrant, to be brighter. I'll show you that a little bit. And so sounds are also important to dogs. Hearing matters a lot for them. They have very good ears, and so that's their second most important sense. So we want to talk about that. The third, the least important sense for a dog is sight. They really don't see all that well. They really track motion and not much else. And so they start with the smell, the second is the sound, and the last thing is the visual confirmation for them. So if you're wanting your dog to see differences, that's not what they're good at. They're really good at smell instead. So a dog's world, when you think about a dog's world, is very smelly. It's very lickable because that's how they actually get a lot of sense into their nose, by licking things, which is why they're trying to lick you or inappropriate things. They're trying to get that smell. That's what they care about. And they can hear their friends and smell them too. They're really good at differentiating sound. So in this one, you can see these are Major's friends, and we wanted to do Taffy and Poochie and Kimmel and show the brighter smell visually around them to show this is how Major's smelling his friends. These are the dogs that matter to Major. And then in the background, you could see that all those we're trying to do a visual representation of the sounds that Major would have heard. And going to talk about this, but there were thousands of dogs at Fort Robinson at one time, and I would like you to imagine the sound of 2,000 dogs barking continuously and what that must have been like to hear. So, and as you probably know, if you know dogs, they don't always do what you want them to do. And so here we put this little image of Taffy running away to show basically dogs that washed out of the program. Taffy was actually a real dog who escaped multiple times, was the Houdini. And there's actually a notice in the Crawford newspaper near Fort Robinson telling locals that this Taffy has escaped again. If you find her, please bring her back. So real not behaving well dog. So we wanted to show that. For when Major's going across the seas, going to Europe, we wanted to show him seasick because dogs do get seasick. They have the potential to get seasick. So I wanted to show how miserable that was. I had lots of soldiers' experience, so I wanted the dogs to be miserable. I want you to note the ear positioning of the dogs in this scene. Dogs, when they're not feeling good or when they're unhappy, can have like a droopy expression, and we wanted these dogs to look very upset, like they have an upset stomach. And then another thing we wanted to show in here is if you go to a dog park and you see dogs that are asking other dogs to play, the way they do this is what's called bowing behavior. They put their heads down and their butts up. And when a dog does that, that's a play motion. What it's saying to any other dog or a person, I want to play with you. And it's a standard dog behavior. So here in this scene, Major's being reaccustomed to civilian life. He's becoming a pet again. So we wanted to show him being able to learn how to play. And so that's how dogs play. So we're trying to show that part of the story. So now you sort of know how dogs see the world, and we're going to talk a lot about dogs. So when you think about that, think of the world as a smelly, lickable place. That sounds pretty cool, but it's hard to see. So now I'm going to get into some of the history. As I said at the beginning, this is a true story, and this is real Sid, who gave up his dog, reading Major Soldier Dog to a bunch of kids this summer. So this is actual Sid. He's still living. And this is baby Sid and baby Major a couple years before Major went into the War Dog program. So this is how this started. And the reason that we know about Sid is that he actually wrote us a letter years ago that told us about this donation of this dog when he was just a little boy, and that sort of formed the basis of writing this book for me. I had the idea for the book before, but I didn't have the star, and so it was this that did it. So I'm going to read this letter to you from Sid. Sid wrote, I was 5 years old in 1943 when the U.S. Army wanted the public to donate their dogs to train for the war effort. One of the breeds they were looking for was Collie, and my pet qualified. All too soon the day came when Major was to leave. The train pulled into the station and stopped. A boxcar door was thrown open, and I saw a wooden crate that was for my dog. A man shouted, hurry up, we've got 3 minutes to get that dog loaded. Another man tried to pick Major up, but the dog struggled free, and soon there were 3 men grappling with a snarling cur. And suddenly my dad said, hey, wait a minute, that dog will follow my son anywhere. Let's have Sid get in the crate and call the dog, and he'll jump right in there. 2 of the men boosted me into the boxcar, and I got into the crate. Here, Major, come on, boy, I said, not being able to look him in the eyes. My dog jumped into the boxcar and went to the crate wagging his tail. I wanted to stay there in the crate with Major and accompany him on his journey, but instead I eased myself from the back of the box around the dog, and a hand grabbed me and pulled me out of the crate. At about the same time, a cover with holes on it was slammed in the end of the crate, and I was lowered to the ground. Then the door of a boxcar slammed shut with a bang that still rings in my memory to this day. And if you talk to Sid, and I wish that he was here, he would tell you that story exactly like that over again. This is his core moment from childhood. And Sid served, he ended up, when he retired from the Army, he was a colonel, and then he taught social studies for years, and he actually traces his patriotism and service to country to this moment. Like, this is what convinced him, like, because he gave his dog up, he felt he owed something back as well. So I wanted to put that here now because why did thousands of people like little Sid, who loved his dog, give up their pets to the military during World War II? And what did those dogs do during the war? What's the point of this? So we're going to talk about that next. So when the United States enters World War II in December of 1941, the U.S. Armed Forces has no dog training program whatsoever. We had never trained dogs in this country. We had used them in World War I, but they were French dogs or British dogs on a limited basis. And suddenly the military decides that it needs dogs and it needs them fast. And they wanted dogs that were really concerned about the threat of Japanese invasion or sabotage in the early days of the war. So they wanted dogs to patrol factories, serve as messengers, detect mines, be scouts. But they had no program, and they'd never done it. So what happened was a bunch of American civilians got together, dog aficionados, dog trainers, and they formed this group called Dogs for Defense. And they were the ones that convinced Americans to donate their animals to the military. And at the beginning of the program, they accepted basically all kinds of dogs from all around the country, and they established these training centers. The military did, the Quartermaster Corps. And the most important of these training centers was at Fort Robinson, Nebraska, and thousands of dogs were trained there. About 15,000 dogs went through Fort Robinson during the course of the war. And donated dogs were trained by the military, and those who couldn't pass the program were sent back to their owners. And after finishing basic training, the dogs were then sent all around the country and all around the world. They served in every theater of the war in World War II. And here's the crazy part, is at the end of the war, they really did send them all back to Fort Robinson, and they detrained them to make them pets again. So they went through a detraining program, and then at government expense, they put them back in crates and shipped them back to their original owners like Sid, and the dogs came home, and they even got their own little doggy discharge paper that I'll show you in a minute. And so this was a civilian effort. And so the woman standing, that's Aline Erlanger. And she was really a leading force in the creation of this program. Here she is doing a promo shot. The woman kneeling or crouching, that's Greer Garson, the actress, an actor from the period. And she donated these two poodles as early donations to the Dogs for Defense program. They never saw combat. They were basically like recruiting show poodles, and they were really well trained, and they went on tours all across the country to basically show what dogs could do. So Greer Garson was an honorary chairperson. Joan Crawford was an honorary chairperson. So they got celebrities. They started this program and gained attention. This is not a great picture, but Aline Erlanger actually also came out to Nebraska. She was at Fort Robinson. She visited for a dog graduation ceremony. She was really involved in the program all through the war, making sure dogs were treated well. And we'll meet her once more in the presentation. And the program was patriotic, but it was also really entrepreneurial. They were trying to raise money for the program. So you could donate your dog to Dogs for Defense, but if you didn't want to donate your dog, you could donate money, and you could enlist your dog in the Dogs for Defense program. And depending on how much you donated, your dog got a military rank. So this is $3 from Mrs. Martin Donovan in the name of Inky. And Inky, for $3, became a corporal in the Army. And he actually got a little certificate and a tag for the dog's collar saying you donated. If you donated $150, you could be a general or an admiral, your dog could be. So it sort of went down. $1 was a private. It just kind of goes up from there. So it was really clever. That's how they funded the program for those donations. And this also feels really modern, too, is they got corporate sponsorship. So they got Purina to come in. And so Purina provided finances, but they also ran all of these ads in magazines. There's just tons of Purina ads, basically. So your dog can fight help us capture Japanese. And then, dogs are wanted for every branch of service, and they served in every branch of the service. And then you can cut out this little certificate and send it to Purina, and so they get your information, right? So very corporate. And then also on your dog, and then they can contact you about donations. So this is how they did it as a civilian effort with military backing. So because of this, because of the celebrities, because of the sponsorships, because of all of the press that they got about this, they gave up their dogs by the thousands. People did this. And so this is a picture. This is Dwayne Hugh. He's giving up his dog Bubby in Minneapolis in 1944 to Sergeant Robert Gorman, who was taking 25 dogs from Minneapolis to Fort Robinson. So he had a shipment of 25, and Bubby is one of them. So giving up your dog is an emotional experience. So, and newspapers ate this up. So there's really great coverage out there. So here's an article from 1943 that I'll read you. Children weep as pets enlist to train in Nebraska. Paul Sims Jr., 8, and his sister Carol wept silently as their German Shepherd pet of 3 years, Slivers, was loaded into an express truck for delivery to the depot. Their parents, Mr. and Mrs. Paul Sims, said the youngsters were less subdued last week when they yelled to all their playmates, "Slivers is going to the Army!" Other youngsters and parents were on hand to see their pets receive a veterinary examination and to be put into formal-looking new crates labeled U.S. Army Dog. So there's lots of press coverage for this. And so dogs were sent to Fort Robinson starting in the fall of 1942. There were other dog training programs. There was one at Front Royal, Virginia, Cat Island, Mississippi, Helena, Montana, which was for sled dogs only. And the last one was in San Carlos, California. Fort Robinson was completely and utterly not ready for this when the order came to say, you guys are going to start a dog training program. They had nothing. And they really had to move fast. And so you might be asking, why Fort Robinson? You know, Nebraskans are very friendly, wonderful people. Fort Robinson is a very established fort, but what is it about Fort Robinson that makes it the most significant dog training program in America? And you would love to say that it was something great, but the truth is it's horses, because Fort Robinson is the last remount depot in the United States. Didn't really use a lot of horses in World War II. They had thousands of them, and they had dogs that needed to be fed. So they got fed horse meat. So dogs got 8 ounces of cooked horse meat, 12 ounces of raw horse meat, 8 ounces of cornmeal, and 8 ounces of commercial dog food a day mixed together. So during the course of the war, at least at a minimum, they were slaughtering 3 horses or mules a day to feed these dogs, and that's why Fort Robinson is the most significant dog training program. We don't talk about that in the children's book. Surprise. So, but you deserve to know the whole story. So they had horses, they had food source, but they didn't have anything else, so they had to build it fast. And they needed to requisition all kinds of crazy things. They requisitioned blank ammunition to train dogs to be accustomed to gunfire. They had to buy flashlights. They had to buy 3,000 leashes, 2,000 chains, lumber for all of these kennels, 600 grooming brushes, 1,000 muzzles, and even a rubber stamp stating U.S. Army Dog, arrange in car for maximum fresh air and ventilation. And they had to do this all without a training manual. As I said, they didn't know how to train dogs. There was no program for this. And they really worked to produce a manual. And they started in 1942, the fall of 42. But by July of 1943, they had produced a manual. And it was TM 10-396 Technical Manual, War Dogs. And that was the document for training military dogs during World War II. And that document is sort of the ancestor of all military dog training that happens today. That manual is it. So that was really important for them to decide how the heck they were going to do this. The training site was huge. It was 50 acres total. It was enclosed entirely by fences. They had a canine hospital. They had an operating room. They had an office, they had a laboratory, they had grooming and supply rooms, they had classroom facilities, a carpenter shop, administrative offices, indoor training sheds, and they had an obstacle course for the dogs that you'll see in just a second. So big. And this is a roster of war dog soldiers, and they had to recruit soldiers. And in the early days, this was crazy slapdash. So the training was run by the Quartermaster Corps. And some of the soldiers that arrived at Fort Robinson to be dog trainers had just been drafted or had just enlisted. They had never done basic training. And they shipped them directly from induction to Fort Robinson. And many of them served, and some of them in combat situations, without ever having gone through basic. And this was the hurry that they were in. And some of them, the men that were sent here, had some experience training dogs. Some were experienced dog trainers. Others had just had hunting dogs or had dogs. But there are some accounts of soldiers who got shipped to Fort Robinson just because some sergeant asked them, "Hey, do you like dogs?" And they said, "Yep." And they were at Fort Robinson training dogs 2 days later. So this was something they had to build very quickly, but by the fall of 1943, they could handle 450 students at once to learn about dog training. And when they were training dogs, they got lectured twice a day. They had twice a day lecture, and they got assigned between 2 and 4 dogs each that were their dogs, and they were supposed to train and manage those 2 dogs and get them through the program and graduation. So a couple excerpts from the all-important training manual are that absolute obedience can only be gained by a dog's respect for you. Never coax your dog, rather command. So it was about command, but then this is the other key part of it that they found was really important. We are not going to work on a theory of fear. Fear will not bring you success with a dog and will never give you a keen and enthusiastic worker. So the strategy was this idea of command. We are going to command dogs to do what we want, but we are not going to make them afraid. This is a partnership. And they got this early on, and that's sort of a core to service dog training. And so they knew what they were doing. To pass the courses, dogs got trained for different things, but they had to learn both voice commands and arm motions for each command, because if they were out in the field and the enemy was near, they did not want to be giving voice commands. They wanted arm commands so the dog could follow that in silence. And so the commands that a dog had to learn in order to pass through Fort Robinson were heel, down, come, sit, stand, stay, speak, hup, which was to jump, get 'em, which was attack, watch, seek, go fetch, out, go find, and go on. And so those are all the commands. They all had arm signals that went with that. Dog had to learn all of those in order to pass through doggy basic training. This poor guy, his job was to train attack dogs. So he is wearing a padded outfit so that he's not completely bitten up. And soldiers got bit a lot. I mean, it's hard to overstate the number of dog bites that happened at Fort Robinson during this period. The records are full of soldiers who were in the infirmary for various bites because they were training dogs to be aggressive. They were training guard dogs, training attack dogs. So here's a piece of, there's a sergeant that was there, J. Western Woodbury. He kept a personal daily log of his tour of duty at Fort Rob in 1943. So on June 21st of 1943, he writes, I got a shepherd, 1 shepherd cross, and a farm collie, Topsy, Sandy, and Tippy. Sandy bit my arms badly, and I went to the hospital. June 23rd, finally got friendly with Sandy and worked him. He's caught on fastest for now. Things are going well with Sandy. July 9th, finally got Sandy to sit without a muzzle and without biting me, so far. July 13th, Sandy bit my foot. Back in the infirmary. So this was not easy work. And they trained dogs for all kinds of things. And they trained them for every branch of the military, and they trained the trainers that went back to other places as well. So you'll see Navy uniforms, you'll see Coast Guard uniforms, you'll see Marines, Army, Air Corps. Everybody is at Fort Robinson learning how to train dogs during World War II. And they trained dogs to do different things, as I mentioned. So they did attack dog training. This is called agitation training. They trained the dog to leap for the arm, to bite, to go for the arm, and to hold. They trained dogs so that they would be not be willing to be touched by strangers. So they trained it so that your handler and only the handler could touch the dog, and the dog would be aggressive towards everyone else. And so you can see that that's what they're doing here. You can also see that the dog is actually chained back into the wood as well, in case, just so this poor guy doesn't get eaten. I love this shot because they dressed people up in German uniforms and had the dogs chase them. And I would like you to notice this guy's pants down here and just how badly that's ripped. So this was not a good duty to get with this snarling dog. Clearly he's been gotten before. So they trained scout dogs to chase people and detect scents, and so they did these obstacle courses where they did that. And I'll show you a video in a minute with that. They trained dogs to carry packs and bandages and to smell out the wounded on the battlefield. So here are dogs with packs at Fort Robinson. And they trained sled dogs. And here they are without any snow at all with this crazy wheeled contraption that they've got. Fort Robinson had its own separate facility for sled dogs. It was completely separate from the rest of the dog camp. It was at the old CCC camp called Little America, if you're a Fort Robinson aficionado. So that was the last thing that they did. And I'm going to show you just a little short video because they took some good videos at Fort Robinson. And I'm just going to narrate a couple things that I want you to see. So we'll see if that's going. All right, I just want you to get a visual of the number of men and dogs we're talking about here. So here they are on parade. And I want you to note the variety of breeds as well, because we're going to talk about that in just a second. And here they're training them to duck with shell fire. So they drop. If there's shell fire, they drop. Everybody drops. And here's the least enviable job at the fort, which is for you to get chased through this crazy obstacle course by a dog that does not know that you are playing. But it was fairly sophisticated. And here's how their houses worked. Later, they moved these up on stilts because they had problems with rats. And then in the back, this is the food wagon. This is how they fed the dogs. That's coming by. And then every soldier was in charge of the grooming of your 2 to 4 dogs. You were responsible for that. That was part of your charge. And so they had to demonstrate good care of your dog. That was part of your training. So lots of things worked really well with the dog training program. But in the early days of World War II, they had some pretty crazy ideas for dogs too, and some things that just didn't work. So one of the early ideas that they had was that dogs could differentiate the sound of American bombers from Japanese bombers, and they would station dogs out, and when the bombers came over, they would know if it was a Japanese air raid that was over a place. That did not work. Dogs could not figure out the difference between, like, they can tell sounds apart, but they couldn't figure out how to train them to do that. So they gave up on that. Another thing that worked better in theory than in practice is this idea of dogs that would sniff out mines. And they thought, oh, dogs could go sniff out mines, and they could see where a mine was in a minefield. And they tested this in the United States, and they plowed up a field, and they put in dummy mines, and they brought out handlers and dogs. And the dogs did really, really well in that situation and found the mines, and it was great. But then they tried to actually do this in Italy during the war, and they discovered a couple things. One is that minefields are uncomfortably close to the front lines, and there's a lot of artillery, and dogs are not great with artillery. The big booming noises just drove the dogs crazy. They just could not cope with heavy artillery barrages. The second thing is that a mine and dummy mines in a plowed field and a real minefield are two very different things. Because a real minefield had shell fragments, it had bodies, it had torn metal, it had all kinds of other smells that interfered with the ability of a dog to sniff a mine that was the only metal thing in a minefield. So that actually didn't work at all, and they actually had to disband that program and ship the dogs back and abandon mine training as something. So they had all of these ideas for what dogs could do, and dogs did a great job, but they were more specialized than that. So we'll talk a little bit about it. But this is a postcard that soldiers put together at Fort Robinson. I just want you to look at the number of breeds that are represented here from this Fort Robinson postcard. In the beginning, they accepted this colossal variety of dogs. Really, they just had to be about 20 inches at the shoulder and over 55 pounds for them to take them. But that did not last. So they found that Great Danes just ate too much. Grooming poodles was just a pain, was just a huge pain. Setters were just honestly just too dumb. Dalmatians were a real problem. They loved Dalmatians, thought they were great dogs, but they discovered, wow, a Dalmatian really shows up really well on the battlefield. That's easy to spot. And so then they got this brilliant idea that they would dump the Dalmatians in big tubs of Rit dye and dye them black. And that worked, but then they discovered that the rain washed the dye away, and so that was the end of Dalmatians in the War Dog program. So by the end of the war, you were really looking at a couple breeds that they were about. They were about Dobermans and they were about German Shepherds as the dogs of choice. They were resilient, they were easy to care for, and I think most importantly, quite honestly, is they looked tough. They looked like a war dog should look. That was sort of their thought. Because the truth is that during World War II, most trainers would have told you, and it shows up again and again in their records and the reminiscences, is that the best scout dog possible was the Border Collie. And the Border Collie was the best dog to have in a war zone because it possessed all 5 traits that the manual said you needed in a war dog. Intelligence, willingness, aggressiveness, sensitivity, and energy. So when anybody is reminiscing about this in the post-war years, talks about their Border Collie as the best dog that they had. So Major's a Border Collie in the book. So once dogs were trained, they got deployed with their handlers to every theater of the war. They patrolled munitions factories, research stations, coastlines. They served throughout the South Pacific. They were particularly good in jungle warfare. They could sniff out snipers. They could sniff out ambushes. So they did quite well there. So Robert Johnson, who served at Fort Robinson, he did an interview in 1944 after returning from combat in New Guinea, where he said, "There are 150 dead Japanese who can testify to the effectiveness of my dogs. My entire crew returned without a scratch." Dogs did over 600 patrols on Okinawa alone. And here are 2 very handsome dogs being cared for very carefully in the South Pacific. Dogs were part of the invasion of Italy in 1943, and they fought throughout Europe. So we sent, in our story, we sent Major to Italy. And I've read claims that I've actually been unable to verify, so take this with a grain of salt, that there were dogs that parachuted in on D-Day with airborne units in 1944. I've never been able to verify that, but it's been claimed. And during the Battle of the Bulge, Fort Robinson sled dog teams were mobilized. The plan was that they were going to airdrop these dogs over Germany to rescue the wounded. But just as they were ready to go, the weather cleared, things changed, and they didn't need them. And so instead, the dogs at Fort Robinson, sled dogs, they were search and rescue dogs for plane crashes. So as the war went on and the threat of Japanese invasion decreased, they started closing dog training centers across the country by mid-1944, but Fort Robinson continued. They had at least a couple thousand dogs on site at any given day. And as I said before, about 15,000 dogs went through Fort Robinson. About 5,000 of those dogs graduated. And then at the end of the war, from all over the country and all over the world, the dogs were sent back to Fort Robinson to be detrained and returned to civilian life. And people really had not forgotten their pets during the war, which is part of the reason they worked so hard for this in the post-war, when the war was over. They actually had to issue communiques to the American public to please stop writing letters about your dog, checking on your dog to these various places. They had to issue direct orders to clerks to stop replying to letters from people because people were like, "How's my dog doing?" And so they just had to say, just stop it. And this is Carol Rover, which is the best name for a dog trainer ever anywhere. Carol Rover, she served as a dog detrainer in 1945, and her job was to get them ready for their original owners to bring them back. And I'll tell you a little bit more about Carol in just a minute. And newspapers loved these heartwarming reunion stories. So here's Major and Sid's article from Wahpeton, North Dakota in 1945. Sidney Moore and his veteran dog, Major. And here's Major's honorable discharge paper from 1945 as a certificate of faithful service and honorable discharge. So you got your dog back, you got a little sheet of paper that said that it had served honorably. So the last thing I want to do is talk a little bit about how we sort of use the history in the book, just to point that out. So we wanted it to be fun and entertaining, but we wanted it to be good history too. So we're really fortunate that we got just tons of images in our collection about what Fort Robinson looked like. So Ming, who was our artist, took like the photos and then she created that as accurately as we could because we wanted it to look right. And I wanted some details to be in there. Sid and Major grew up in Wahpeton, North Dakota. So this is the Richland County Courthouse on the left that I wanted to show, and then there's the little tiny Richland County Courthouse there on the right, and I talked to the North Dakota State Historical Society to make sure that that looked like that in 1945. So we just took scenes from what happened for induction, and we just plugged Major into them. We have great collections of World War II stuff. So here's the Stars and Stripes from the end of war in Europe, and so here's the actual copy, and then that's how we represented it in the book. And Ming is a great artist. I am not an artist, and she was really tolerant of me and my craziness. For this is because this one on the left, this is the end of the war and victory, and you're seeing things from Major's perspective. So you see a lot of feet because he's a dog. But the boots on the left were her original sketch, and the boots on the right is how we ended up. But the boots on the left, those are early war boots, those higher boots. Those are boots that were issued in the first part of the war, and the boots on the right are the boots that they wore in Europe in 1945. And so I was like, I like it, but I don't like the boots. And so that's my own neuroses right there for that. And we wanted the people to be right. And in the book, Major's best friend is this guy, Zeke. And of course, Zeke is a real person. And that's him. That's Richard Zika, a skinny guy from Detroit, who in later life was very active in making sure that the War Dogs program was not forgotten, was remembered. And so I wanted to honor him and put them in there. So there he is, and that's how we used the introduction to that image. And then remember Aline Erlanger from the beginning, one of the founders of the War Dogs program. There she is at Fort Robinson, and she's like this little hidden character in the book. She was out there for a dog graduation, so I put her in Major's graduation. So it's like a little Easter egg that only you guys are going to know about, because there she is in the upper corner. We don't talk about her at all, but there's the person who made all this stuff possible. She's just this hidden person. And the other thing I wanted to do was correct some of the inaccuracies in the historical record. And so this is Carol Rover Simmons in how she's represented in real life and in the book. The official records of the War Dog Training Program said that there were no female dog trainers ever, that there weren't any, right? And so the official records just gloss over women entirely. But Carol showed up at Fort Robinson and gave us copies of her orders, pictures of her there, and it made it very clear that she was a War Dog trainer. So I wanted her to be in the book. So we corrected that historical record, and she was a soldier, so I wanted to make sure she was wearing her stripes in the book as well. So I included her there. So I want to have a few minutes for questions. So just to wrap up, we covered 3 things today. We covered a children's book about dogs in World War II, a little bit about how dogs see the world. We covered the Dogs for Defense program and how it worked at Fort Robinson, Nebraska. And then I gave you just a little bit of a behind-the-scenes look at creating a historically accurate children's book. But the big one that I wanted you to think about was this big question, is would you give up your pet to help your country? So that's what I want you to think about. Because our story, Major's story, ends happily, but some dogs did not come home. I mean, they were killed in combat. They died from disease. They were injured in accidents, or they could not be detrained to be safe as a pet again, and they were destroyed at Fort Robinson. So not everybody's pet came home. So it didn't all end happily for people. So if you didn't know, and you didn't think about what could happen, would you give up your pet to help your country? So now I want some time for questions, and but I also want to make one last pitch, because this is my organization, that if you like this stuff, if you like what we're doing, and you're not a member of History Nebraska, stop by the gift shop on the way out and sign up, because it's really members that allow us to do this kind of programming, allow us to produce this kind of this work. So if you like this stuff, do that, and if you want to buy a book and have me sign it, I'll do that too. So thank you very much, and time for a few minutes for questions. So anybody have any questions for me? Yeah.
Is there a place in the national cemeteries where dogs are buried by soldiers? A dog cemetery anywhere?
In modern wars, maybe. World War II, no. They did leave dog cemeteries behind in the South Pacific on various islands. There is no official dog cemetery at Fort Robinson, though many dogs are buried there somewhere, but not marked. In the way,
Have you thought about doing a second book and doing the adult very interesting.
Well, one of the things that we co-published this with another publisher, and they're interested in doing basically a young adult book version of this, like a chapter book that would do this, not from the dog's perspective, but from a person's perspective,
Sure.
and then cover different aspects of the Fort Robinson training program. So I've got some notes on what that could look like. I have not done that yet, but I would love to. That would be
I'd
great.
certainly encourage it.
Thank you.
What did it take to demilitarize him or to bring him back to being?
All right, I have not been repeating the question, and I apologize. So, what did it take to demilitarize the dogs so that they could go back home? They did a bunch of things. One of the things that they would do for dogs is they actually ran a battery with chargers up through the arm, and so when the dog tried to bite the arm, because they had trained him to bite the arm, they'd get a shock. And so if the dog was an attack dog, that's how you would try to desensitize, to shock them until they didn't want to do that anymore. And so then, and part of it was just a really slow refamiliarization process. So it'd be like, only your handler can touch you. And now we're going to introduce somebody else that can touch you. And then another person that can touch you. And another person that can touch you. They were super well-trained dogs. I mean, one of the stories Sid tells is that when Major came home, his dad used to take Major down to the bar in Wahpeton, North Dakota, and bet people on how many tricks his dog could do, and because Major could do all of these, all of those commands. So they tried it. It didn't always work. And the truth is, the dogs that had been trained to be attack dogs were the least successful dogs to bring back to home.
Yes. Would you share something about your illustrator? Where you found her?
A question about sharing something about my illustrator, about how we found Illustrator. The way children's books work is I've never actually met Ming personally. You just never do. As an author, we've Skyped, we've talked back and forth. We never met in person. The way that it happens is that you solicit, you find people's work in these online databases, and you find somebody who you think, yeah, that looks like how it looks in my head, and then you ask them, a bunch of them, to submit a few panels from what you've done, and then you pay them for that. It's the greatest thing about it is the artist gets paid no matter who gets selected. And so we picked 3, looked at those, and Ming was just the one who was great. And then I also was really clear, and I said, I know this is going to be annoying, but it's really important to me that the uniforms look right and the boots are right and the rest. Can you do this? And she was like, yeah, sure, why not? So that was important to me too. One more.
The handlers had more than one dog, and they didn't necessarily accompany them into the theaters of war. What did it take to adapt a dog that was used to a specific handler to somebody else as their handler?
Okay, the question is, what did it take to adapt to a new handler? If I could summarize that. It wasn't easy, and they found this is really problematic because that's why they had 2 dogs. One was a backup. And so what they found actually is that you really needed to send the handlers into combat with the dogs that were their dogs. They couldn't do this in a different way. But they had problems because they had handlers who were wounded, handlers who were killed, and then they had dogs, and they had to give them to a new person. That was a real period of an adjustment, and it didn't necessarily work real well. You spend 8 weeks with a dog, you train this dog, you care about the dog, and suddenly the dog has a new master, and you got to get him into the field quickly. That did not work particularly well. So they really struggled with that. And we have a diary of a guy who picks up somebody who's wounded, his other 2 dogs. Now he's got 4 dogs to care for, and he's trying to keep the relationship between these 4 dogs together that aren't not used to being together, and it's clearly a nightmare for him. So not easy is my short answer to that.
Can you go over again how we find this on YouTube, if you know that, or the other woman, how we would find these?
You can simply Google Nebraska State Historical Society or Nebraska History Nebraska and YouTube.
Yeah, so Google History Nebraska and YouTube, and you'll find our channel where all of these are sitting up there.
Yeah, could we say, why did you get so interested in this aspect of, because of the animals, because of the war, or what started you?
Well, the question is, why did I get so interested in this topic? Fort Robinson is one of the historic sites that we manage, so we do the historic interpretation there. And if you go there, you can actually see where a lot of the dog run was. We actually have a guide. We mow the paths. None of the buildings are there, but you can see how it was all laid out in the space. And then in our interpret center there, we actually have artifacts. We have we have dog crates and chains and the rest of it. So we have a really deep collection on this. But one of the things that I was thinking about is this is a really cool story about patriotism and sacrifice, and nobody knows anything about it. How do we get this into more people's hands, and how do we get people to understand it? And, normally our thing would be to write an article or something, which, we've done. There's an excellent 2-book history about Fort Robinson. But I thought, wouldn't this be really cool if we did this for kids so they could get this concept? And so that was the way that I wanted to do it, because I thought, this is really amazing that people gave up their pets for this program, and nobody talks about this today. So that's what I was trying to correct more than anything. All right.
So where was the facility in comparison to the camp on the Fort Robinson site?
All right, so if you drive in, the question is where was the camp in comparison to the site? So if you drive into to Fort Robinson from Crawford, the post headquarters where our museum is will be on your right, and then the camp was basically to your left. It was right in the center there. If you know Fort Robinson, Comanche Hall, that's sort of along the end, one of those really big buildings that you can rent if you've got 250 family members that are there. That was a war dog barracks for the war dog trainers, because it was closest to the camp during World War II. There's not. I mean, the Army wasn't interested in preserving, the war dog program. So you're really just looking at sort of where stuff was and the ruins of that. And they also really kept terrible records. They didn't think that these records were important. So what I've got about the number of dogs and where dogs went, where dogs served is really fragmentary. It's based on what one clerk saved or one soldier saved. All right. Anything else? One more.
Just more of a comment. Thanks for sharing. But I think what I thought of when I was seeing this is that this finally settles the debate on who's superior, dogs or cats, unless there's some war cat program.
Cat program.
I don't see anything about a war cat program, so go dogs.
So there was no war cat program, absolutely. I don't want to offend the cat owners in the room, but no, I don't think there were any cats that served in World War II. So please correct me afterwards if I'm wrong. I will be around to answer any further questions. But thank you all so much for being here today. We really appreciate it. And for those of you watching at home, thanks for tuning in.